Before we begin, I should say that I welcome very hard questions. You need not worry about insulting me. I am uninsultable. The topic of my talk today is the legitimate role of government in a free society. Now, I'm going to say many things that will break with conventional wisdom, so again, feel free to ask questions if time permits. One of the justifications for the growth of government in our country, far beyond that envisioned by the founders of our great nation, is to promote justice and fairness. Well, that's a worthy goal, but we might also ask, what is justice and fairness? And what is the legitimate role of government in a free society? Let me just spend a few minutes discussing what the founders saw as the legitimate role of the federal government in our society. And in order to do that, let's turn to the rule book that they gave us, namely the United States Constitution. Most of what the founders saw as the legitimate role for the federal government is found in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And let me just briefly quote sections thereof. It says, Congress has the power to lay, collect taxes, duties, and imposts to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and the general welfare of the United States. Additionally, Congress is authorized to borrow money on the credit of the United States, to regulate commerce with foreign nations among several states and several Indian tribes. They are also authorized by the Constitution to coin money, establish post office and post roads, and raise and support armies. Now, if it's not on this list of things, then Congress can't do it. And the framers granted the United States Congress taxing and spending powers for these and a few other activities. Now, nowhere in the Constitution do we find authority for Congress to tax and spend for up to 3/4 of what Congress taxes and spends for today. In other words, there's no constitutional authority for farm subsidies, bank bailouts, food stamps, not to mention midnight basketball. I think that we can safely say that we made a significant departure from the constitutional principles of individual freedom and limited government that made us a rich nation in the first place. And these principles of freedom were embodied in our nation through the combined institutions of private ownership of property and free enterprise. Now, through numerous successful attacks, private property and free enterprise that the framers envisioned for us are mere skeletons of their past. And Thomas Jefferson anticipated this when he said, "The natural progress of things is for government to gain ground and for liberty to yield." Now, the best way to look at this process of government gaining ground and liberty yielding is to ask what has happened to government taxing and spending. Ladies and gentlemen, there's only one way to look at taxes. Taxes represent government claims on private property. And if government were to tax private property at 100%, it would indeed confiscate private property, and taxes are going up. An even better measure of what government does is to look at spending. Now, in 1902, expenditures at all levels of government, federal, state, and local levels of government, totaled $1.7 billion. That year, the average taxpayer paid $60 in federal, state, and local taxes. In fact, from 1787 until 1920, federal expenditures were only 3% of the GDP, except during wartime. Today, federal expenditures alone are $3.5 trillion and over 25% of the GDP. State and local governments spend close to $2 trillion. The average taxpayer today pays $8,000 a year in federal, state, and local taxes. Now, what's the significance of this? Well, The significance is, as time goes by, you and I own less and less of our most valuable property, namely ourselves and the fruits of our labor. That is, the average taxpayer works from January 1st until May 1st to pay federal, state, and local taxes. That means we're spending 4 months out of the year producing things, and we do not have the rights to decide how the fruits of our labor will be used. Someone else makes that decision. Now keep in mind, a working definition of slavery is that you work 12 months, and it is someone else that makes a decision how the fruits of your labor will be used. Now, in the economic sphere, the founders thought that relatively free markets, or what is called capitalism, was the most effective social organization for the promotion of individual freedom. Indeed, capitalism is defined as a system wherein individuals are free to pursue their own interests so long as they do not violate the property rights of others. There is voluntary exchange. There are private property rights held in goods and services. And indeed, much of the original intent of the United States Constitution, as seen in the document itself, as well as the Federalist Papers and other papers that debated the Constitution, was to bring about a climate in which this kind of social organization could occur, namely peaceable, voluntary exchange among Americans. Now, the great benefit that's often trivialized or not acknowledged, the great benefit of the free enterprise system is that through private ownership and control, it minimizes the capacity of one person to coerce another person. Additionally, the coercive powers of the state are minimized and restricted to the legitimate functions of government. And we might ask, what are the legitimate functions of government in a free society? Well, one legitimate function of government is to protect us from international thugs violating our private property rights. So that says that one legitimate function of government is to provide for national defense. Another legitimate function of government is to protect you and me from domestic thugs violating our private property rights. So that says at some level there should be police services. Other legitimate functions of government are those of enforcing constitutional order, the adjudication of disputes, and the provision of certain public goods as an economist would define them. Now, in order to pay for these legitimate and constitutionally mandated functions of government, each citizen is obliged to pay his share. Now, for the past half century or more, free enterprise and what it implies has been under unrelenting attack. Americans from all walks of life, whether they realize it or not, have demonstrated a deep and abiding contempt for private property rights and economic freedom. Free enterprise is threatened today, somewhat ironically, not because of its failure. It's threatened because of its success. That is, capitalism or free enterprise has been so successful in eliminating the traditional problems of mankind, such as disease, pestilence, hunger, and gross poverty, that all other human problems appear to us to be at once inexcusable and unbearable. The desire by many Americans to eliminate these so-called unbearable and inexcusable problems has led us away from the basic ideals and principles upon which our nation was built. In the name of other ideals, such as equality of income, sex and race balance, affordable housing, medical care, orderly markets, consumer protection, energy conservation, just to name a few, we have abandoned many personal freedoms. As a result of widespread control by government in an effort to achieve these so-called higher objectives, we Americans are increasingly being subordinated to the point where considerations of personal liberty are but tertiary and secondary matters. they're increasingly being treated as dirt in our country. Now, the ultimate end to this process, ladies and gentlemen, is totalitarianism. Now, I am not saying that we are a totalitarian nation yet. But if you ask the question, which way are we headed? Tiny steps at a time. Are we headed towards more liberty, or are we headed towards more government control of our lives? It would have to unambiguously be the latter. Now remember, if you go towards any goal, even if it's tiny steps at a time, it's just a matter of when you're going to reach that goal. Or as the great philosopher David Hume said, it is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. Or another way, a better way I'd like to put it, is the way that my late colleague Leonard Read, the founder of the Foundation of Economic Education in New York, the way he put it, he said that if you wanted to take liberty away from Americans, you had to know how to cook a frog. Now Leonard Read said, you can't put on a pot of boiling water and then throw the frog in the water, because the frog's reflexes are so quick that as soon as his feet touch the boiling water, he would hop away and be free. Leonard Read said the way to cook a frog is to put on a pot of cold water, put the frog in the water, and heat it up bit by bit. And by the time the frog realized he was being cooked, it was too late. That's the same thing with Americans. If someone came over here talking about taking all of our freedom all at once, we would righteously rebel. But they can talk about taking away our freedom bit by bit. Now, the primary justification for this attack on private property, economic freedom, and privacy can be found in people's desire for government to do good. We all say things like, government should help the elderly, government should care for college students, government should help failing businesses, government should help other deserving segments of our society. Well, it might be nice to say those things, but we have to recognize that government has no resources of its very own. Now, what I mean by that is that those programs coming out of Washington or coming out of your state capital, they don't represent congressmen and senators and state legislators reaching in their own pockets and sending out the money. Moreover, there's no tooth fairy or Santa Claus giving them the money. Now, so when you recognize that government has no resources of its very own, that forces you to recognize that the only way government can give one American citizen $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. Now, if you think I'm being too loose with the terms intimidation, threats, and coercion, you have April 15th to check me out on that. Now, we Americans, we do things, we ask government to do things that if a private person did the identical thing, we would roundly condemn him as an ordinary, low-down, despicable thief. For example, I could see an elderly lady sleeping out in the street in downtown Dallas. The lady, she needs some medical attention, she's hungry, and she needs some shelter. Now, I could walk up to Dr. Cox with a gun in my hand. I could say, give me your $200. Then, having gotten his $200, I go downtown and help the lady out. I buy her some medicine, some medical attention, and some food. Now, would you consider me guilty of a crime? Well, you ought to, because I've committed theft. And what is theft? Theft is taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, most Americans can agree with me on that. But here's the problem. Is there any conceptual distinction between that act, where I walked up to Dr. Cox and demanded $200 from him to help the lady out, and or is there any distinction between that act and when the agents of Congress, namely the IRS, come up to me and say, Williams, you know that $200 you made last week that you planned to buy a nice bottle of Chateau de Chem Sauterne wine with it? You will not do that with the money. You'll give it to us and we will go downtown and help the lady out. I assert that there's no conceptual distinction between those two acts. Both acts involve taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, if you press me for a distinction, I can only find one. And that distinction ought to be trivial to moral people. That is, the first act where I walked up to Dr. Cox and took his money, that is illegal theft. The second act where the agents of Congress came up and took my money, that is legal theft. The only difference is a matter of legality. And for moral people, legality alone cannot be our guide, because there are many things in this world that are or were legal, but clearly immoral. That is, slavery was legal. Did that make it moral? The Nazi persecution of the Jews, the Stalinist purges, the Maoist purges, they were all legal, but were they moral? And so the moral question that confronts us is there a moral case for taking what belongs to one person and giving it to another to whom it does not belong? Now, for the Christians among us, it stands out even in a more stark fashion. That is, when God gave Moses the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," he did not mean that thou shalt not steal unless you got a majority vote in Congress. It was absolute. And I'm very sure that if you ask God, well, is it okay to be a recipient of stolen property? That would probably be deemed a sin as well. Now, don't get me wrong, ladies and gentlemen. I believe in helping our fellow man in need. I believe that reaching into your own pockets to help your fellow man in need is praiseworthy and laudable. Reaching in somebody else's pockets to help them out is despicable and worthy of condemnation. Now, a lot of people say, well, we need big business, we need big government to offset the power of big business. Well, I think that's nonsense, because big business, they can't get $1 from us. Let's say Exxon. Exxon cannot get $1 from me unless I volunteer to give it to them. That is, I have to get out of my chair voluntarily. I have to get into my car voluntarily. I have to drive up in this man's lot voluntarily and give him some money for gasoline. That does not describe my relationship with government. Government can get money from me whether I want to give it to them or not, even if it requires going over my dead body. Now, we have a lot of problems in our society because many people want government to do good. And so free enterprise or free markets and voluntary exchange are roundly denounced by people who call themselves caring, or I call them the defenders of the new human rights. These defenders of the new human rights are the chief supporters of reduced property rights, reduced rights to profits. They're anti-competition and pro-monopoly. They are pro-control and pro-coercion by the state. And these people in our country and other places in the world, they believe that they have more intelligence and superior wisdom to the rest of us. And they think that they have been ordained to forcibly impose that wisdom on the rest of us. Now, tyrants will attack free markets. Why do tyrants want to attack free markets? Well, free markets imply voluntary exchange, and tyrants do not trust that people behaving voluntarily will do what the tyrant thinks that they want to do what the tyrant thinks they ought to do. So they want to replace the market with industrial planning, economic planning. Well, I'll give you a definition of economic planning that will last you the rest of your lives. Economic planning is nothing more than the forcible superseding of somebody else's plan by the powerful elite. For example, my daughter might plan to work for the hardware store guy down the street for $2 an hour. She says it's okay. The hardware store guy says it's okay. Her mother says it's okay. Her father says it's okay. But the powerful elite will say, Williams, we're going to supersede that plan because it's not being transacted at the price we think it ought to be transacted at, namely $7.35 an hour. Or alternatively, I might plan to buy a Honda motorcycle from a Japanese producer. The powerful elite will say, Williams, we're going to supersede your plan through tariffs and quotas because we think you ought to buy a Harley Davidson. Now, of course, many of these people are just plain evil. But many people do all this in the name of good. But do-gooders do not realize that most good done in this world is not done in the name of good. If you ask me, well, Williams, what's the noblest of human motivations? What's that one human motivation that gets wonderful things done? I would say greed. I love greed. Now, I'm not talking about ripping off people. I'm not talking about fraud. I'm talking about people trying to get more for themselves. You know, for example, you might ask the question, well, last winter, Texas cattle ranchers, they got up in the middle of the night, went out to take care of stray cows, just to make sure New Yorkers had beef on their shelves. Why do you think they did that? Do you think it's because Texas cattle ranchers love New Yorkers? They may hate New Yorkers. I'm not that wild about New Yorkers myself, but they make sure that beef gets to New York every single day. Why? Because they want more for themselves. That's the benefit of the free market, as opposed to government regulation. I'm told my time is winding up, isn't it? But let me say just one concluding thing, that we might find conservatives, they rail against food stamps, they rail against aid to family-dependent children, they rail against legal aid, but they come out in support for aid to dependent motorcycle companies, aid to dependent banks, aid to dependent farmers. And as such, conservatives as well as liberals, Democrats as well as Republicans, they prove H.L. Mencken's definition of an election quite correct. And H.L. Mencken, he was a political satirist of the Baltimore Sun, and somebody asked him to give a definition of an election. And H.L. Mencken replied, government is a broker in pillage, and every election is an advance auction of the sale of stolen goods. To the extent that H.L. Mencken is correct, it's not the politicians, it's we Americans are to blame for our problems. Thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Dr. Williams, once again I have the chills, which I get every time I hear you speak. I know something's very bright when that happens. We have time for two very quick questions. First is, how do we extricate ourselves from the situation where the majority can now vote themselves money from the minority?
Well, it's going to be pretty hard. The founders tried to do this through limiting government. And if you look at some of the quotations of the founders, they saw that government was evil. Matter of fact, I believe with Thomas Paine said government under the best conditions is a necessary evil, under the worst an intolerable one. And so I think that what we have to do, if it is all possible, is to reduce the power that government has. And maybe one way to do that is to have some kind of amendment limiting the amount of spending that government can do. I prefer 10%. And people say, how come 10%? How come? Why do you want to only give Congress 10% of the GDP to spend? And my response is that if 10% is good enough for the Baptist Church, it ought to be good enough for Congress.
And then the second question is, do you see much value to be added by the GOP proposal to include a reference to constitutional authority in each new bill?
Oh, yes, I do. I see. That's very important. Matter of fact, Congressman John Shadegg from Arizona, he has introduced an amendment. He calls it, he's introduced a bill since 1995, every 2 sessions, every 2 years in Congress. It's called the Enumerated Powers Act, which would require that Congress point to a particular statement in the Constitution for whatever they do. It's gone down to blazing defeat by these people who put their hand on the Bible and swear to uphold and defend the United States Constitution. But I think we have to have a meaningful version of that.
Well, we have a large audience here who, of course, totally captivated. We thank you so much for sharing your time with us. We're grateful, we're humble, and blessed to have you here today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
If we thought you could see us, we'd all be standing.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much.